It's very clear that unless you're an alcoholic, and provided you're an adult, that 2 drinks per week maximum is about the upper threshold beyond which you're going to start getting some health debt. I'm lucky that it's not something that's a strong draw for me.
Me too.
I have friends that are recovered alcoholics, and their lives are so much better as a function of being sober. But for non-alcoholics, I think everyone should just know the health risks, especially women, where the risks for breast cancer and other types of cancers are elevated so very much. Once, actually, I was out to dinner with a colleague years ago, and I declined drinking that evening. I was just talking to the visiting speaker, and she said, God, that's so boring. Drinkers don't like people who don't drink because it takes the fun out of it for them. Now, of course, we know the sleep you get after even one drink is vastly diminished. And I think that alcohol, to me, never felt good. I never liked it. And it was a recipe for, there was a lot of fights. There was a lot of, there were a lot of bad stuff happens when people are drinking.
I've stood on the door of 1,000 club nights in my career, right, as a club promoter. And I can promise you, nothing good happens in nightclubs after 1 in the morning. I am patient zero. I am the doctor of late night parties, okay? Like, that's one of my expertise. Nothing good happens in a nightclub. It's this sort of messy, sloppy fights and kissing people you shouldn't and stumbling all over the place and stuff. If you go out and you don't drink and you go home at 1 in the morning, I think you probably get to capture about 80% of the enjoyment of the event that you would have done had you have drank, pre-drinks, gone out, done the whole thing. I totally get what you mean. When you've taken a little bit of time away from it and you look at it in the harsh light of day, the effects that alcohol gives you just aren't that enjoyable.
The idea that like someone can quote unquote hold their liquor is such like it's been made synonymous with, masculine ideals. It's like, it's kind of crazy because we know it also crushes testosterone levels. There's a very different picture of a young drunk versus an old drunk. Someone who's been just drinking for too many years, it's not a pretty picture.
It's sad.
They become infantile. Because of the structure of alcohol, it is what's called both water soluble and fat soluble. Translated into what's meaningful for you, what that means is when you drink alcohol, it can pass into all the cells and tissues of your body. It has no trouble just passing right into those cells. So unlike a lot of substances and drugs that actually attach to the surface of cells, to receptors as they're called, little parking spots, and then trigger a bunch of downstreams, like domino cascades of effects, alcohol actually has its own direct effects on cells because it can really just pass into those cells. I should mention that there are 3 main types of alcohol. There's isopropyl, methyl, and ethyl alcohol, and only the last one, ethyl alcohol or ethanol, is fit for human consumption. However, it is still toxic, okay? It produces substantial stress and damage to cells. When you ingest ethanol, it has to be converted into something else because it is toxic to the body. And there's a molecule inside of all of us called NAD. So when you ingest ethanol, NAD and related biochemical pathways are involved in converting that ethanol into something called acetaldehyde. It's broken down into acetaldehyde. And if you thought ethanol was bad, acetaldehyde is particularly bad. Acetaldehyde is poison. It will kill cells. It damages and kills cells, and it is indiscriminate as to which cells it damages and kills. So the key thing to understand here is that when you ingest alcohol, you are, yes, ingesting a poison, and that poison is converted into an even worse poison in your body, and some percentage of that worse poison is converted into a form of calories that you can use to generate energy, generate ATP. And the reason why alcohol is considered empty calories is because that entire process is very metabolically costly, but there's no real nutritive value of the calories that it creates. You can use it for immediate energy, but it can't be stored in any kind of meaningful or beneficial way. It doesn't provide any vitamins. It doesn't provide any amino acids. It doesn't provide any fatty acids. It's truly empty calories. Now, the important thing to understand is that it is the poison, the acetaldehyde itself, that leads to the effect of being inebriated or drunk. I think most people don't realize that being drunk is actually a poison-induced disruption in the way that your neural circuits work. So what happens when alcohol gets into the brain that makes us feel tipsy or drunk, and in some people makes people feel really especially energized and happy? Well, alcohol is indiscriminate in terms of which brain areas it goes to. Again, it doesn't bind to particular receptors, but it does seem to have a propensity or an affinity for particular brain areas that are involved in certain kinds of thinking and behavior. So one of the first things that happens is that there's a slight, at least after the first drink or second drink, there's a slight suppression in the activity of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. This is an area of your neocortex that's involved in thinking and planning, and perhaps above all, in suppression of impulsive behavior. Alcohol has a very strong effect in suppressing the neural networks that are involved in memory formation and storage. This is why oftentimes we forget the events of a night out if we've been drinking. One of the more important things to know about the effects of alcohol in the brain is this disruption in top-down inhibition, but also that areas of the brain that are involved in flexible behavior. So the key thing to understand is that when people drink, the prefrontal cortex and top-down inhibition is diminished. That is, habitual behavior and impulsive behavior starts to increase. Now, what's interesting is this is true in the short term, so after people have 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 drinks, but it's also true that the more often that people drink, there are changes in the very circuits that underlie habitual and impulsive behavior. My read of the data are, as you pointed out, that yes, alcohol is a poison, but many things are a poison and the dose determines the poison. It seems that our threshold for what we call moderate or low amounts of drinking is shifting nowadays. I don't know if that had something to do with the alcohol episode that we did, but here's what I do know. The data say that 0 to 2 drinks per week, you're probably fine, provided you're not an alcoholic and you're of age, okay? And you're not pregnant, or dealing with some other, something that would make it a case where you wouldn't want to drink at all. 0 to 2 drinks per week. Now, what happens past 2 drinks per week depends on a lot of other contextual factors, okay? First of all, how well or poorly you metabolize alcohol, how much alcohol dehydrogenase you tend to express. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of the so-called negative effects of alcohol are due to disruptions in sleep and gut microbiome. So those are indirect, right? Alcohol is changing, for the worse, the gut microbiome and sleep patterns. But what these larger scale studies show is that if you look at the amount of gray matter thinning, which occurs with age regardless, gray matter being the neurons in the brain, white matter being the fiber tracts, the amount of gray matter thinning starts to increase as you get out past 2 drinks per week. My read of the data, and I know there are people that disagree with me, is that 0 is better than any.